Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we would be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper of 26 July 2018. Now let us begin. Now we have taken the first article from the editorial page on page 8 and we have taken the second article from page 11. Now what both of these articles talk about is the recent tour of Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the African countries of Uganda and Rwanda. And apart from this, he would also be visiting South Africa for the 10th BRICS summit. Now, this would be the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Rwanda. And apart from this, Prime Minister Narendra Modi will also address the Ugandan Parliament. And it was during the address to the Ugandan Parliament that Prime Minister Narendra Modi highlighted the principles guiding India's foreign policy engagement with Africa. Now, what we'll do with regards to this article is first understand the 10 guiding principles that have been highlighted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi that highlight India's engagement with Africa. And we'll try to understand the points that have been highlighted by the author in the editorial while understanding these 10 guiding principles. Now, the first guiding principle highlighted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi was that Africa will be at the top of India's foreign policy priorities. And apart from this, India will also have a sustained and regular engagement with African nations so as to intensify and deepen its relations with Africa. When currently India engages with Africa in the India-Africa Forum Summit, wherein the third India-Africa Forum Summit was held in 2015. Apart from this, India is also engaging with Africa through the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, wherein India has partnered with Japan to form a connectivity infrastructure projects that would connect Asia and Africa. Apart from this, India is also engaging with the Indian Ocean Rim countries, meaning those countries which lie on the shore of the Indian Ocean, such as Kenya, Tanzania, South Africa, through the Indian Ocean Rim Association. And apart from this, India also engages in military exercises, bilateral visits, and other forms of engagement with specific African countries. Now, the second guiding principle for Indian foreign policy in Africa would be that India's development partnership with Africa will be guided by priorities that have been formed by respective African countries. Now, it means that whenever India would form development projects in Africa, these projects would rely on local African talent, and these projects would be intended to build local capacities in African nations. Now, apart from this, the projects would be intended to create local opportunities, such as in terms of jobs. Now, the reason this principle is important with regards to India's engagement with Africa is because whenever China has engaged in development partnership with African nations, it has relied on Chinese talent, wherein it has imported Chinese workers to work on African projects. And apart from this, the Chinese projects have intended to increase the capacities for Chinese companies rather than increasing the capacities of local industries. And it is within this context that India's development partnership with Africa will have to be guided by priorities that have been formed by respective African countries. Now, the third guiding principle is that India will keep its market open and make it easier for Africa to trade with India, wherein the Indian government will help Indian industries to invest in Africa. So you have Indian telecom companies such as Bharti Mittal, among other, or petroleum and gas industries such as ONGC that have been investing in Africa. Now, the fourth guiding principle is that India will harness its experience with digital revolution to support Africa's development, wherein India is forming the Pan-African E-Network to support Africa's development, such as in the improvement in delivery of public services, digital literacy, financial inclusion, among other forms of digital abilities to support Africa's development. Now, the fifth guiding principle for Indian foreign policy in Africa is that India will collaborate with Africa to improve its agricultural output. Now, currently, Africa has 60% of world's arable land, but only has 10% of the global agricultural output. And therefore, India will collaborate with Africa to improve its agricultural output. So, the Indian government and Indian companies have signed MOUs or Memorandum of Understanding with countries such as Mozambique, Kenya, among other, to import agricultural goods. And apart from this, the Indian government and Indian companies have also helped these countries to improve their agricultural output. Now, the sixth guiding principle for Indian foreign policy in Africa will be that India will collaborate with Africa to ensure a just international climate order, preserve biodiversity, and adopt clean and efficient energy sources. Now, by just international climate order, it means that India would collaborate with Africa in supporting the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities principle with regards to climate change. Apart from this, India will also collaborate with Africa in supporting the Paris Agreement. Now, moreover, India is also collaborating with African countries in the adoption of clean and efficient energy sources, such as solar energy, through the International Solar Alliance. Apart from this, India and Africa are collaborating together in the global negotiations on climate change talks. The seventh guiding principle is that India will strengthen its cooperation with Africa in combating terrorism and extremism. And apart from this, India would also collaborate with Africa in supporting the United Nations in advancing and keeping peace. Wherein currently India has its soldiers and personnel deployed under the United Nations peacekeeping force in African countries such as Congo, Liberia, and most recently, India also deployed the Garhwal Regiment to the African country of South Sudan. Now, the eighth guiding principle is that India will work with African nations to keep the oceans open, and India will ensure with African nations that there is cooperation and not competition in the eastern shores of Africa. Now, as you might be aware, that China currently has its first overseas base in Djibouti. Now you have to understand that even though India has said that it will ensure cooperation in the eastern shores of Africa and not competition, India also has a listening post in Madagascar, which is on the eastern shores of Africa. Now apart from this, India is also trying to form a military base in Assumption Island, which is in Seychelles, which also lies on the eastern shores of Africa. Now the ninth guiding principle is that India would collaborate with Africa to ensure that Africa does not turn into a theatre of rival ambitions. Now, during the African liberation movements from the 1950s to the 1970s, India had always said and maintained the principle that India will never exploit Africa. When during the liberation period of Africa, various European countries such as France, United Kingdom, apart from the United States, engaged in the exploitation of the natural resources of Africa. And it was during that time that India stated the principle that India will not exploit Africa for its natural resources. Now, in the current period, Africa is an emerging continent with emerging economies, which has vast amount of natural wealth in terms of timber, oil and gas, gold, diamonds. And now China has become a major power that intends to harvest the natural resources of Africa. And India also has ambitions in terms of its engagement with Africa. However, India has said that it will not engage in rivalry with China for Africa's natural resources. Now, the 10th and the final principle highlighted by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which would guide India's foreign policy in Africa, is that India will work together with Africa for a just, representative, and a democratic global order, wherein India is currently engaging with African nations for the reform of the United Nations Security Council, wherein India has stated that Africa should also be equally represented in an expanded United Nations Security Council. And apart from this, India would work together with Africa for the reform of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and other global institutions. Now, hopefully, up till here, you've understood the 10 guiding principles for Indian foreign policy in Africa. Now, let us understand as to where it would be placed in your UPSC syllabus. Now, both of those articles and the explanation given in this section would be placed in GS Paper 2 within the section International Relations, wherein previously a question has been asked in GS Paper 2 in 2015, which had asked the increasing interest of India in Africa has its pros and cons. Critically examine this statement. Wherein a question for your practice: examine the principles of engagement of India with Africa. How does it differ from China's engagement with Africa? Now, to answer this question, you can use both the articles and the explanation given in this section. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from the editorial page on page 8. Now what this article talks about is that the Right to Education Act would be amended, wherein this act would be amended to provide states with the power to detain students who fail the qualifying examination in class 5 or class 8. And the author in this editorial has raised various concerns with the proposed decision to amend the Right to Education Act so as to provide power to states to detain students who fail the qualifying examination in Class 5 or Class 8. Now, the first concern raised by the author is that evaluation to pass and fail, especially in state boards, is inefficient. When according to the author, this inefficient evaluation methods that are used in state boards would negatively hamper disadvantaged students, wherein disadvantaged students who do not have access to tuitions or have weak family support or have learning disabilities would negatively be hampered by the inefficient evaluation methods that are conducted by state boards. The second concern raised by the author is that this proposal may increase the dropouts among failed students, wherein one of the objectives of the Right to Education Act is to ensure guaranteed elementary education, but this proposal to detain students may increase their dropouts and thereby weakening the objectives of the Right to Education Act itself. The third concern raised by the author is that detention is not an incentive for improving academic performance, wherein the policy of detention or holding back a student is not an incentive for improving that student's academic performance, wherein the policy of detention is a method of punishing that student. The fourth and the final concern raised by the author is that the policy of detention does not address the main issue, which is that India has a broken school education system that produces weak students. So now hopefully up till here you've understood the four concerns that have been raised by the author with regards to the proposal to amend the Right to Education Act so as to provide power to states and state boards to detain students who have failed the qualifying examination in Class 5 or Class 8. Wherein the first concern raised by the author is that evaluation to pass or fail in state boards is inefficient, and this inefficient evaluation method in state boards would negatively hamper disadvantaged students. The second concern raised by the author is that this policy of detention may increase dropouts among failed students, wherein one of the objectives of the Right to Education Act was to guarantee the continued presence of the child in school. But this policy of detention may have the opposite effect of increasing dropout among failed students and thereby weakening the Right to Education Act. The third concern raised by the author is that detention is not an incentive for improving academic performance, wherein the policy of detention is a punishment for the student and does not provide an incentive for the student to improve his or her academic performance. And the fourth and the final concern raised by the author is that detention does not address the main issue of India's broken education system, wherein it is the broken education system in India that produces weak students. Now, with regards to your UPSC syllabus, wherein the policy of detention and its concerns would be placed in GS paper 2 within the section Social Justice, and more specifically in the subsection Issues relating to development of education. Now, you have to understand that this news is currently in transition, and we'll have to wait and see on how the Government of India moves forward with the amendment to the Right to Education Act. But hopefully, you've understood the concerns with the policy of detention. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 18. Now there's some facts for prelims that we should understand from this article. Wherein the satellite of the European Space Agency, called the Mars Express spacecraft, and the Mars Express spacecraft of the European Space Agency provided various data that gave the first evidence of a stable liquid water lake on Mars. But this first evidence of a stable liquid water lake has been found under ice on the southern polar plane of Mars. And the stable liquid water lake may contain evidences of microbial life. Now hopefully up till here you've understood the basic facts for prelims from this article, wherein the satellite of the European Space Agency called Mars Express spacecraft has provided the data that led to the first evidences of a stable liquid water lake, and this stable liquid water lake is located below a thick sheet of ice on the southern polar plains of Mars, and the presence of a stable liquid water lake on Mars leads to the assumption that it may also contain evidences of microbial life. Now there's one another aspect that you should understand from this article is that the stable liquid water lake that is present on Mars has a temperature in the range of minus 10 degrees Celsius to 70 degrees Celsius. Then why is the lake not in a solid ice form? And the main reason that this lake is in a stable liquid form is because it has a high salt content. And high salt content reduces the freezing temperature of water. So now hopefully you also understand is that the stable liquid water lake on Mars is currently in a liquid state. Even though the temperature ranges from minus 10 degrees Celsius to minus 70 degrees Celsius, it's because the lake has high salt content, and this high salt content reduces the freezing temperature of water. So hopefully you've understood the basic facts from this article that are required to be known for prelims. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 10. Now the reason this article is in the news is because 5 privilege notices have been given to the Lok Sabha Speaker. So what we'll do with regards to this article is first understand as to what is a privilege motion. After that, we'll try to understand as to what is parliamentary privileges. After that, we'll try to understand as to what is breach of privilege. And lastly, we'll try to understand as to what is the Committee on Privileges. Now you have to understand that this article was not taken in DNH or the Daily News headlines. And the reason it was not taken in DNH is because the article did not explain any of those 4 topics. But nevertheless, we'll try to understand all 4 of these aspects. Now a privilege motion is a notice by any member of either house of the parliament, which means it includes both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha. And moreover, a privilege motion is also a notice by any member of a state legislature. And this notice can be against anyone who has been accused of breach of privilege. So a privilege motion is a notice that has been given by any member of Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha or a state legislature against anyone who has been accused of breach of privilege. Now before understanding as to what is a breach of privilege, you have to first understand as to what are the parliamentary privileges, and then we'll understand on how they can be breached. Now parliamentary privileges are certain rights and immunities that are enjoyed by members of parliament. And the main purpose for these parliamentary privileges is that they can effectively discharge their functions, which means that parliamentary privileges helps members of Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha to discharge their duty in an independent and effective manner without any fear from outside interference. So under Article 105 and Article 194 of the Constitution of India provides for the powers, privileges and immunities that are enjoyed by Parliament and state legislature and the members of the Parliament and state legislatures. However, there has been one concern with regards to parliamentary privileges, wherein the Parliament has not yet codified what are privileges that are available to its members. And since parliamentary privileges have not been codified, this has led to the misuse of certain privileges by the members of Parliament and state legislatures. Now let us understand as to what is a breach of privilege. Now when any of these rights and immunities that have been guaranteed under parliamentary privileges is disregarded by anyone, including other members of parliament, the offence is called a breach of privilege. And this breach of privilege is punishable under law of parliament. Now this breach of privilege may include publishing of news items, editorials, statements made in newspapers, magazines or TV, public speeches that can be considered as violating any of the rights and immunities that member of parliaments or member of state legislatures enjoy as part of their parliamentary privileges. And if there has been a breach of privilege, a notice is moved in the form of a motion by any member of either house, and this motion is moved against the person who they held guilty of being in breach of privilege. And each house, meaning the Rajya Sabha and Lok Sabha, have the right to punish anyone for breach of privilege, which is considered as a contempt of parliament. Now with regards to this, a 15-member committee is then nominated by the Lok Sabha Speaker to examine every issue involving breach of privilege of Lok Sabha, and upon reference by the Lok Sabha Speaker, the committee shall make recommendations. And in similar terms, in the Rajya Sabha, the chairman shall nominate a committee of privileges which consists of 10 members. Now this is an important fact that you should remember with regards to your prelims examination, wherein the Committee on Privileges in Lok Sabha consists of 15 members, while a Committee on Privileges in Rajya Sabha consists of 10 members. And this privilege committee has then the power to take evidence or call for papers, records or documents, and including the attendance of the required persons, so as to examine every issue involving the breach of privilege of that house. So now hopefully you have understood as to what is Committee on Privileges, what is breach of privilege, what are parliamentary privileges, and what is a privilege motion. And now with regards to UPSC syllabus, The explanation given in this section would be placed in GS paper 2 within the section Constitution and Polity, within the subsection Parliament and State Legislatures, Powers and Privileges, and issues arising out of these. When previously questions have been asked, such as what is a privilege motion, which was asked 3 times in 1998, 2000, and 2003 in the mains examination. And apart from this, a similar question was asked in 2008 as to what is contempt of parliament. And similarly, a question was asked in GS paper 2 in 2014, which had asked that the powers, privileges, and immunities of parliament and its members, as envisioned in Article 105 of the Constitution, leaves room for a large number of uncodified privileges to continue. Assess the reasons for the absence of legal codification of the parliamentary privileges. How can this problem be addressed? And so, for practice, you can try to answer all 3 of these questions with the explanation given in this section. And so, now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now, we have taken this article from page 9. Now, as you might be aware, the Israeli parliament passed a new law. And under this law, Israel is now a nation state of Jewish people. Now, what we'll do with regards to this article is understand about this new law that has been passed by Israel from the perspective of your prelims examination and not your mains examination. And this is because currently the new law that has been passed by Israel does not fall under the purview of your mains examination syllabus. When Israel is not in India's neighborhood, and this law currently does not affect India's interest. But this law needs to be understood from the perspective of your prelims examination. Now, as you might be aware, there was a question asked in the prelims of 2018, which had asked the term two-state solution is sometimes mentioned in the news in the context of the affairs of. The correct answer to this question would be Israel. Now, you have to understand that the referenced current event of the two-state solution was the shifting of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And the international importance of this event was that it violated the two-state solution. And it is within this context that the new law passed by Israel becomes relevant for your prelims examination, when the current event is that Israeli parliament has passed a new law whereby making Israel a nation state of the Jewish people. And the international importance of this current event is that it supports the idea or the movement of Zionism. So what we'll do is understand what is Zionism. Now, Zionism is a movement which began for the re-establishment of a Jewish nation. Now, this Jewish nation was to be established in the ancient homeland of the Jews. And this ancient homeland of the Jews was called Eretz Israel and is located in what is called today's Palestine and Israel. And this Zionist movement led to the creation of the State of Israel. And the movement currently intends for the development and protection of Israel. So now hopefully up till here you understood that Zionism is a movement which began for the re-establishment of a Jewish nation, wherein there was an earlier ancient homeland of the Jews called Eretz Israel in Palestine. And the Zionism movement began for the re-establishment of this Jewish nation within Palestine, and thereby leading to the creation of Israel. And the Zionist movement currently has evolved for the intention of development and protection of Israel. So a question for your practice is the term Zionism is mentioned in the context of the affairs of China, Israel, Mexico, or South Korea. And from this explanation, you should understand that the term Zionism is mentioned in the context of Israel. So now hopefully you've understood as to what is Zionism and why is it relevant for your prelims examination. And now with this, we come to an end in the analysis of today's newspaper. Now we move on to the question for today.